Okay, so I'll do a little introduction, I guess, and then we'll just start talking.
Mhm.
Um, so this is the first episode of a kind of new podcast series that I'm doing, devoted to the intersection of pretty much of religious philosophy and critical theory, um, with some art and music stuff too. But those are the two main things. And I'm very happy to have Justin Sledge as the first guest. Justin hosts a wonderful podcast, Esoterica, devoted to, I guess the way you put it is like uh, occultism with an academic approach, right?
Mhm.
You sort of foreground that its uh, sources are academic and
Mm.
sort of the history of it and so forth. Is that a fair way of putting it?
Yeah, yeah. Thanks for having me on. Yeah, that's basically it. It's sort of the academic study of Western esotericism, mostly prior to about 1750, which is where my expertise really drops off. Which is, I think, if funny for reasons we could talk about, because I think that's where most people's interest begins to spike. Is in the period of Romanticism, and then of course in the 19th and 20th centuries when it comes to occultism, which I think there's a very specific reason why that happens, but people are often shocked that I just don't know anything about Kenneth Grant or tarot cards or something.
You don't know anything about Kenneth Grant.
Yeah, I don't. I mean, I might know the Wikipedia
Right. Yeah.
level, about Kenneth Grant, but yeah, it's my knowledge about 20th century stuff is uh is just bad. And I think the reason for that is, I guess I'll say, is I think that most people become interested in esotericism out of religious practice. And most accessible religious esoteric practice is 20th century, late 19th and 20th century, the Golden Dawn and Aleister Crowley and all that stuff. And I don't come at this from a ritual practice point of view. And so I don't have any, it's never been interesting to me as a source of ritual practice or religious belief. And therefore I've never plugged into it in that angle. And therefore the 20th century at some level, it's also just intellectually less interesting to me
Right.
than other periods of time. And so I since I don't come at it at that angle, I just have never had much of an interest in what goes on in the 19th and 20th centuries when it comes to esotericism. Not to say that's not important, it's just not my
Yeah.
interest.
No. Yeah. Yeah. And for me, it's a pretty wide range. I okay. So like, yeah, I first encountered your channel. Um, forget exactly what the first video I saw. I think it started kind of showing up in my feed here and there. Like I consume a lot of occultism content, on YouTube. So and more is kind of picture of your face and stuff. And then I think, a big interest for me right now is early Christianity and the relationship of early Jewish mysticism,
Mhm.
pre Kabbalah to the development of Christianity. And you have a bunch of great videos on that and on the development of Kabbalah out of those forms of mysticism. And so I began, looking at a couple of those, kind of over and over actually, because there's a lot of content there that I didn't know about. And I began, got to a point where you kind of watch enough of a content creator that you're like, well, wait, who is this person? Let me sort of lurk a little bit and sort of see what they're like, what they're like. And so I saw then in your bio on your website that I mean, two things. One is that you like underground metal,
Mhm.
which was cool, and two, that you are a Marxist,
Mhm.
and forget what what I saw at the time. But anyway, so something gave me the sense that you were aware of kind of Althusserian Marxism and
Mhm.
stuff like Badiou and Deleuze and Meillassioux and this kind of thing. Um, which is not something that one necessarily expects from someone with an occultism podcast. Even if you have an academic approach to it, that's actually it's a pretty small scene. uh,
Yeah, and it has everything to do with the fact that I have sort of two divergent areas of interest, academically, one being philosophy, which I did the PhD in, and then religious studies, which I have another advanced degree in. And it just so happens that in many ways those don't talk to each other. And so I live in two very different I can live in two very different headspaces. I can be reading, I was just finished an episode this week on Pistis Sophia, which is just a bear. It is the single most complicated text from antiquity, I think. Think I would die on that hill. And then also I'm really at home, in the world of sort of post-structural and post-structural metaphysics or whatever. So there's a very different worlds, but I kind of swim in both of them.
yeah, and so okay, and yeah, that's awesome. And I think it's pretty much the oh yeah. So then I think it was just a few days after I thought about contacting you, then you came out with a video about Marx, actually,
Hmm.
and that was sort of like, what is Marx's relationship to apocalypticism, or to the occult? Is it crazy to think of Marx as a kind of Gnostic in a way, and so forth? Um, and uh, and then we ended up actually. So I reached out, and then we actually hung out in Detroit for a little bit and got
Hmm.
got to talk some. So I have a little more awareness of your views generally. And but yeah, what I wanted to home in on as a main question is you know, for you, like what you're sort of giving an answer in advance already, that you see the realm of post-structuralist political theory type of philosophy as totally separate from occultism. But this idea of materialism also is quite vague, actually. And I happened, funnily enough, I was listening to an episode of yours at the gym yesterday, uh, um, on Hodowich, and you mentioned that um, she was an influence on Lacan. That one of my favorite works of his, Seminar 20. Uh, he discusses her in relation to feminine jouissance, and in the continental philosophy world, people will actually use, you know, so in continental philosophy, there's this very nebulous slippage between ontology, political theory, gender theory, and this kind of thing. And so people will have whole political theory approaches to Marxist subjectivity that are about, say, bringing in Lacan's conception of feminine desire, and so forth. And of course, Deleuze and Guattari talk about occultism constantly. There's always going on with shamanism and alchemy and so forth, and really using those as materials. And so yeah, I guess there are four questions I have for you. I'm tempted to just list them all out, actually, um, because I want to try to get to them all. But I think I'll give you a chance to talk a little bit about just this first one. Like, um, what does materialism mean to you? And given that materialism, there's all kinds of theories of materialism, but that it has something to do with an intersection between economic forces, social forces, emotions, desires, and so forth. You know, where does how does one, I guess, if you want to totally draw a line between that and the spiritual, where is that line?
This is a super complicated question, and a question I think that doesn't get asked nearly enough to so-called materialists. Um, I suppose I'll say that the answer is sort of two or threefold at least. Um, the first answer is that um, it's materialism in sort of the Marxist sense. That's to say that history, the motor of history, is struggle over the control of the materiality of production and reproduction of society. So that's to say that history has this sort of internal engine, and that engine or is the struggle over those forces of material production and reproduction. I don't think it's reducible to that in a linear way. Like I'm an Althusserian in the sense that that process is not it's more of an emergent process than it is a Newtonian mechanical process where you can sort of deduce all things from the superstructure down to some economic base. I do buy Althusser's line that it occurs at the last moment that never comes. So I buy that kind of aleatory materialism that Althusser put forward toward I guess the end of his career. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that that is exclusive of supernatural causation. So I'm not I don't subscribe to any supernatural causation, which is just to say uh, I'm not convinced that there are any gods or entities like that are imposing themselves on history outside of ideas. And I do think ideas can be very powerful. In fact, Marx did too. I mean, the German ideology makes it very clear that ruling ideas can affect history. And what more powerful ruling idea has there ever been than the idea of religion or gods or whatever? So, so in some sense, I don't know what that is. We can unpack that more in a bit. And I guess the third thing I'll say is that, and this will bring us back to Meillassioux at some level, is that um, that some forms of science, whatever we want to call that, uh, inhuman instrumental ability to understand nature, devoid of human experience, that is revealed to us, at least up to this point, experimentally, that there seems to be, whatever, 25 particles and four forces. And that seems to be sufficient to explain basically everything that we've encountered. And so, insofar as we don't have experimental evidence to indicate anything else, then I'm very conservative. I'm very much an Occamite here. That if we don't have a reason to multiply entities, then we shouldn't do it. I really am a principle of a metaphysical economy that multiplying entities is typically a bad idea. And so, so those are the three things that come to mind most specifically. But I want to stress that whatever materialism can exist now, it's certainly not going to be the materialism of Descartes or the mechanists or even sort of the vulgar Marxists of the 19th century. I think that we're going to have to be dealing with a very exotic definition of materiality. And that very exotic definition of materiality is going to be inclusive of many things that I think even someone like Plekhanov and the sort of early 20th century materialists who rejected vulgar materialism, I think it's going to have to be inclusive of forces and substances even more exotic than they imagined.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, your response makes a lot of sense. I guess that it sort of brings up, there's kind of three questions that come to mind. I'm trying to decide which one to go with first, um, or whether to try to pursue all of them. And they're all sort of debate mode style questions, sort of, well, what about this kind of, but like, if that's okay.
That's fine.
um, like, so let's say that ideas uh, are a major driving force in history and political history and so forth. I think the question is like, if ideas are these kind of noetic things, like a lot of occultism and mysticism is about ideas, right? So that like especially if one has an ecumenical approach, and it's not like only one religion is the real religion, and that there's, where practices, um, uh, like esoteric practices tend to have to do with, um, you know, apprehending ideas, or, finding, making contact with a sort of fundamental idea that, animates you, and then manifesting it in the world, and like in, maybe a great, gray area is, um, like mystical, like corporate mystical self-help literature and stuff, like Think and Grow Rich or whatever, where like, like CEOs and stuff, like they're in their profane world, but they're basically, a lot of them are sort of use mystical techniques basically to make money, or to have, to succeed, and that actually, um, maybe another way of putting the question is, uh, where is the line between, esotericism and like therapeutic life, uh, you know, and and then if like, you know, if political subjectivity has to do with sort of, um, you know, bringing ideas to life in, in an animated way, and it's actually very similar to a lot of esoteric techniques, where's the line? Something like that.
I mean, I suppose if the question is, where can we draw the line between something like base and superstructure, to put it in a very vulgar way, I would say you can't. I just don't think you can draw that line. I think that materialism, in the way that I would articulate it, is just a statement about the ontological priority. That is to say that there wouldn't be ideas without people, but the people come first and the ideas come afterwards, and the people are material beings. But the ideas, of course, can supervene back upon them, and I think that history bears that out. I think even Marx believes that, at least in the German ideology, like I said. Um, so there's that. I think that the base materiality can give rise to supervening conditions, strong emergence, and ideas, ruling ideas, to use Marx's language as an example of that strong emergence vis-a-vis supervene, the power of those ideas to supervene back upon that base. But I don't know where you can draw the line. I don't think that's possible. I think that I think it's complex enough that some kind of like crude quantification of it isn't going to give you, you're not going to get that. But when it comes to the question of esotericism and political economy, I mean, I would say that at some level, sure. I mean, the idea of apocalypticism is the idea that jumps to mind most immediately. That sort of this really, third century BCE, first century idea of apocalypticism. And we could talk more about what that is, but how that got built into the fundamental structure of Christianity and Islam, and to Judaism to some lesser degree, but still there. That in the West, at least, we don't get out of that logic. The apocalyptic logic is just simply it is one of the logics by which all thought occurs, and that's I think an example in the West where an idea has come to fundamentally frame everything from political economy to metaphysics. And Marx is a great example of this. Marx, if you think about Marx's conception of ideology as thinking thoughts and acting from a place of ideas that you're not conscious of, but through which, economic systems are functioning as if you're possessed by them, I think is the best way of putting it. Then
Yeah,
Marx is a classic
exactly.
example of,
Demon possession,
I think
basically.
it's a bit like demon possession. I think ideology is quite similar to demon possession. But insofar as Marx is diagnosing that, Marx and Engels, because Marx never talked about false consciousness, that's all Engels. But uh, he was an apocalyptic prophet. I mean,
Absolutely.
apocalypticism is functioning in his thought in a very clear way. Now he's tethered it to this materialist understanding of history, but it's unavoidably apocalyptic in its reasoning. And even when you listen to the way Marxists talk, Lenin or whatever, they talk about the end of history and this sort of great unveiling of things, and it's all going to come to an end and one final apocalyptic battle, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a place where I think uh, esoteric ideas have come to not only influence political economy, but frame it. It's not a fringe idea, it's just the idea. And that's true whether it's, Fukuyama or Marx um, or Smithian sort of invisible
Yeah.
hand correcting the market. It's there. It's absolutely saturated into the
Yeah.
core functioning of political economy.
Yeah. And I would imagine that with someone like Marx, a lot of those ideas were, something like that they were living within Christianity. And then, um, thinkers like Marx, Zizek is kind of like this more recently, or kind of like, Zizek sort of endorses this kind of weird atheist Christianity, but like,
Mhm.
uh, where from a Marxist perspective, you sort of reject like official religion, but then there is, like as Zizek puts it, there's like a true kind of body of Christ, which is uh, this kind of nexus of, um, revolutionaries and
Mhm.
psychoanalysts and artists and things like that that are bound by love, bound by a kind of eschatological love, basically. That something like, well, maybe that's what Jesus was talking about too, or whatever. Um, and I guess actually with that, uh, speaking of Zizek, um, he and Badiou and other figures in the kind of Althusserian Marxism scene talk a lot about this notion of the event, and
Mhm.
so the event is often compared to the miraculous. So for someone like Badiou, I think you speak in a very similar way to Badiou, I would say, basically, where like, I don't know if you really know Badiou, but like, where he's a staunch, he just he repeats over and over again that he's an atheist, but then he's kind of hacking into the notion of a miracle, basically, where an event is something that, it's kind of this gift from God. It's something unforeseen that the current regime of causality you wouldn't have expected it to bring about, and it's this kind of opportunity to then sort of live with faith. It's translated as fidelity
Mhm.
into English to kind of secularize it further, but he's basically saying faith. Um, and um, that so yeah, that would be, I guess that's the other thing, is that like in the even if one is a even if one is both a scientific materialist in terms of everything is ultimately reducible to matter in some kind of scientific sense, or whatever science ends up discovering, that's what everything is reducible to. uh, the sort of philosophical political theory materialism is operating in a place where causality kind of breaks down, just because we know so little about how causality works in the social field.
Right. Well, I think Badiou, what separates Badiou and myself, uh, where I would differ from him, is that it's less, I think, about religious faith for Badiou, but more the fact that Badiou is just a straightforward Platonist. I mean, he's a self-admitted Platonist. He believes like set theory is ontology. I mean, he really is like. So I don't think of him as a materialist in the classical sense of that word, and maybe not in any sense of that word, but rather he represents a kind of fidelity to communism a la Plato, which is a very different kind of communist genealogy, where I would trace my communist genealogy to the Stoics, because people forget, the Stoics had a theory of communism too that's fundamentally, radically material, very opposed, a utopian, just the same as the Platonic conception of it, but radically different. So I would say that's why there can be we sound similar, But under the hood, I think that those things are quite different. And I also, so let's say of Zizek, Zizek is, really a kind of materialist in the Hegelian tradition, of course. And for him, the whole business of the atheistized Christianity is just a fact, and I think he's right about this at some level, is that Marx and Marxism or acting unconsciously with these apocalyptic religious uh, spiritual, I would say, elements inside of the so-called Marxist materialism. And Zizek says I think he just puts forward what is the most Hegelian thing to put forward. They're operating unconsciously. They should just operate consciously. And he's like, this is how we square that circle. That we don't need to reject either, but synthesize both. And I think that he makes that move vis-a-vis Christianity. I make that move vis-a-vis Judaism, which has a much, just as rich theory of messianism, but a messianism of expectation, not a messianism of it's kind of already done. Maybe a messianic triumphalism. So I come out of that from a more Benjaminian,
Right.
kind of angle. And so, but I think we all have the same kinds of balls in the air, and I think that's what is interesting is that um, we don't have the luxury. I don't feel like I have the luxury of dropping one of those balls, materialism, spirituality, um, and some kind of critique of political economy. I don't think I don't have the luxury of dropping either of those three, but and I think putting those three into conversation is going to be a very, very complicated. It's a very complicated conversation in a way that I appreciate Zizek and I appreciate Badiou, but come at it myself quite differently.
Um, yeah, great answer. Um, yeah, I mean, you mentioned Judaism. Judaism probably is in some ways, it's always been a bit easier to integrate Judaism with secularism than Christianity with secularism in a way. In terms of sort of having uh, an overt paradigm. Um, uh, the last, okay, wait. So one more question on the sort of abstract side of things, and then I want to go follow in that direction about um, the idea of kind of how to integrate these things as a practical philosopher, practically as a philosopher working today. But um, you mentioned Hegel. Uh, one dimension of German idealism generally that both Hegel and Schelling suggest, and this is something that there's this guy I've been reading, Gabriel Catren, who kind of leans into this a bit. Um, uh, is that the current scientific paradigm has contradictions in it too, right?
Mhm.
And so uh, the really famous one is, of course, quantum physics and relativity, that they can't both be true, uh, and that um, yet they both work. So it seems as though it's inevitable that science will that's not a criticism of science. It's on the contrary a suggestion that science has this real traction on the real, and that just like in any other sphere there are contradictions, and that um, you know part of what the human spirit does is gnaw on these contradictions, and that uh, at certain key moments um, a new insight emerges and the contradiction is kind of transcended, and this is a Hegelian point basically that
Mhm.
that Marx uses as well in a more materialist register. So I mean, but can you imagine, are you open to the thought that science exists within God's mind in some sense, and that we may discover something really fundamental, and that might turn out to be, uh, that Kabbalistic cosmogony is true. you know,
I, I think that if you're a priori predisposed against a metaphysical position, that's not a really materialist thing to do.
right.
Um, so sure, I'm open to the possibility. In fact, the likelihood. I think that the God hypothesis is just a pretty good hypothesis. I think it's eminently reasonable. So I've never identified, or I don't identify as an atheist. I don't like that because I don't think that's a real position. I don't even know how you could be entitled to that position, aside from just sort of a negation, like we just don't have evidence of there being gods, and therefore I happen to not believe in them. I don't find that position very interesting, but it seems to me that the divine is eminently that it's eminently likely that such a thing could exist. I just find the case that we don't see, given the kind of observations we've made, and also I would say given the kind of arguments that have been put forward historically, I don't think any of those arguments succeed. And I don't think that observation has yielded the existence of such beings. Now, again, do I want to pull the whole Soviet, Yuri Gagarin gets into space and the first thing he says is, "I don't see any gods up here." So, Soviet atheism must be true. I mean, that's like laughably, um, laughable. And whether that's Yuri Gagarin in space, or us with a bunch of boson detectors or meson detectors or whatever, muon detectors. I don't think you're going to find God with a muon detector. Um, but yeah, I'm absolutely open to the possibility of materialism being incorrect. I'm also open to the possibility that, and this is the old Stoic idea, that there can be gods and materialism still be true.
Absolutely.
So I don't think that one logically excludes the other. The Stoics were pious materialists, extremely pious materialists. Cleanthes has written one of the great monotheistic hymns of the ancient world. Chrysippus as well, and in fact, I would say there's no Western occultism without Stoics, even though the Neoplatonists get all the credit. But yeah, I'm open to that possibility. In fact,
Do
I'm
you have
open to
much
that
of a
likelihood.
take on Deleuze's reading of the Stoics?
What about Deleuze's reading of Stoics?
Do you have a take on it at all? I know he kind of takes inspiration from them a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think his focus on the lecta, in the logic of sense, the Stoics have this peculiar. I mean, they're hyper materialists in a way that I don't think any of us can actually imagine being as materialist as they are. I mean, they even think that that words are substances at some level. And he has this whole business about the things said, and what he wants to do, of course, and this is classic Deleuze and the logic of sense, is he wants to show that the lecta haunt. Um, I think he describes it like little creatures running along the surface of their materialism. That the lecta, the things said in the Stoic cosmology, actually haunt the system in a way that undoes their materialism. Um, it could cut both ways. I think that in the way that Deleuze reads it, it does that. I think that if you look more closely, and this is always what Deleuze does, that if you look more closely at what Chrysippus says about the lecta, is that what he's doing with them is showing um, that there are other forms of ontology aside from existence, and that subsistence is an ontological register for the Stoics, and the lecta exist at that lower resolution level of existence. I don't think it does what Deleuze wants it to do. And Deleuze does this too with Duns Scotus as well. He'll take Duns Scotus out of context and say that Duns Scotus is uh, touting the belief of the univocity
Yeah,
of God. And
his
Duns
reading of
Scotus
Duns
doesn't say
Scotus is
that.
really weird.
um,
I mean, he takes pride in that stuff. He sort of he seems to sort of describe himself as, what does he call it? Like buggering.
yeah, buggering them. Yeah,
Yeah.
he actually just straight up says it. I'm just kind of like turn these guys around and make them sing. And yeah, he turns them into these kind of you know uh sodomistical ventriloquist puppets that get them to sing and dance according to what Deleuze wants them to do. And it's clever and it's fun if you know the history of philosophy well, but it's not good if you've never read Duns Scotus or not read the Stoics or not read Spinoza, and then you go pick up, the logic of sense or, difference of repetition, and you read those and don't realize that what's happening here is a kind of weird necromancy where he summoned them back to life, but making them sing and dance according to the will of
Yeah.
Deleuze and not according to I don't know. Duns Scotus, I think it's to me the most shocking example where Scotus um, repeatedly says, I am not committed to the idea of the univocity of God. I'm committed to the concept of univocity operating at the level of lecta, of things said. And Deleuze just like straight up ignores that.
Yeah,
Um,
it's a very different protocol in French philosophy. Like there's it's like even within academia in the continental philosophy world, like there's just not as much of a um an imperative the way there is in the English speaking world to like be honest or something, I guess, or just kind of like to be like, okay, this is a fair reading of this, and now like I'm maybe going to take it and put a spin on it or something like that. They'll just kind of do it. It's like this,
yeah, and it's
just
not French
just
philosophy.
just
It's really
gaslighting.
it's really just like French philosophy of a certain time period. It's French philosophy from like 65 to 75, where you could get away with that kind of stuff. But French philosophy prior to that didn't do that kind of stuff. And French philosophy since, and Badiou doesn't do that kind of stuff. And of course, Badiou's a bad example because he hated Deleuze, but or rather, they did not get along in the 60s. Um,
I feel like but Badu, I think, misrepresents what he's trying to do sometimes, I think.
Yeah, I mean, well, Badiou, with the fascism of the potato and all that stuff. Again, I think there's the Badiou now who's much more, he's a cuddly old man as opposed to the Badiou of, the Maoist 60s where he's going around beating people up with his gang. I mean, Deleuze had to defend his dissertation in hiding because Deleuze had just gotten one of his lungs removed. And they had shut down because of 68, they had shut down the university. So no one was allowed to do anything. And Badiou and his like Maoist gang were, prowling around the Sorbonne, beating anyone up who was, dare to teach a class or defend a dissertation. So they had to like hide and have lookouts to make sure that Badiou's gang. I mean, that's a very different situation in the 60s.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I would characterize that kind of, no philosophy, sort of playing fast and loose with the history of philosophy. Um, and you have to understand also is that part of what's motivating that, and this is the thing that I think historically doesn't get where often the Anglophone world misses this, that Deleuze is writing those books. So when he writes the Spinoza book, when he writes the Leibniz book, when he's writing those books, he's writing those because the French college system decided that that would be the philosopher for that year, and that all of the lectures and all the tests to enter the Sorbonne would be based on that philosopher. And so Deleuze just has to teach it. And so I think what's
I didn't
happening is
know
that
that.
everybody in
Interesting.
France is reading Spinoza at the same time. That's why you get all these Spinoza books coming out in whatever, 60 whatever, in Leibniz books, and it follows this path. Um, is that everyone's in on the joke. Everyone knows that Deleuze is mucking about with these guys, that he's twisting it in a funny way. And so everyone reading this has already read tons of Leibniz or ton of Spinoza or whatever. And so everyone is in on the joke. It's just that Anglophone readers aren't in on the joke. And because they've
Yeah.
never, and so the joke's on them. So they go
I
read the logic of sense or difference of repetition or whatever, and they don't get the historical context. Again, this is why political economy matters. Like the historical context of these things matter. And then they read it in isolation in graduate school, and their only impression of Spinoza or Duns Scotus is from this one Deleuze book. And then you
yeah.
actually read Duns Scotus, and you're like, that's not what he says at all.
I think with Spinoza, it's actually had the craziest effect since Spinoza, unlike Duns Scotus or the Stoics, Spinoza is someone that you're expected to like genuinely read and know about, that his work sort of applies to modernity in a more direct way. And like you can tell if someone says they're into Spinoza and they just start talking about Deleuze that like It's really different.
You
Like
can tell
this
they've never read Spinoza.
couldn't be more different.
Yeah. And again with the I'm talking about the big book on Spinoza. There's some neat stuff in there, and I think there
Yeah,
are genuine, powerful insights. Um, to think of Deleuze, to think of Spinoza's ontology as a system of expressions is, I think, a wonderful way of framing and then focusing on how power operates in Spinoza's thinking was a huge breakthrough. But yeah, when you hear people talk about power and expression, um, in Spinoza, I'm like, well, I know that I know who you've read.
right,
Um,
exactly.
Same when,
Um,
yeah, yeah. So it's not that I'm against people reading that stuff. It's just that I think that, you know, uh, there's like a shamanic journey you need to go on. And I think that you need to like, read some Spinoza before you know, read expressionism as philosophy or whatever.
do you, I guess while we're talking about, I want to switch to the topic of sort of doing philosophy in our time, kind of. But like while we're talking about Spinoza, do you have any takes on like Spinoza's life? I was reading I was reading some kind of biographical stuff about him recently, and just kind of refreshing on his, like his life in Amsterdam and his, excommunication from the Jewish community that he was in. Like, um, I don't. Let's see.
He liked to make spiders fight. That's one of the earliest stories we have about him is that and people wonder about the story is true or not, but I think it is true that he would catch spiders and he had a little box and he would make them fight like gladiators.
Whoa.
And he took a great deal of joy in watching these spiders fight. Um, I think it's true, but when I lived in Amsterdam and I could have lived in Spinoza's shadow, I would go on these like pilgrimages to Spinoza sites, whether it's his house in Voorburg or his house in Amsterdam's not there anymore. But I go to The Hague and go to his grave and sort of sit at his grave and reflect, or his house in The Hague, who someone lives in his house in The Hague. Um, I don't know about Spinoza's life. I guess the thing that I would tell people is that one of the biggest myths about Spinoza that needs to be finally put to bed is that he was like a loner, that he was sort of this isolated, lens grinding.
No, yeah, he was
He
such a Chad. Like I
is
mean,
such well connected. Uh, you know, people came. He held court. People really came from far and wide to talk to him and to engage with him. He wrote extensively in his letters. Sadly, most of those letters were destroyed when he died. But and Leibniz, of course, is the most famous person that comes to visit him. Although Leibniz was a total jackass and says it never happened, and he hates Spinoza, which is horseshit. Um,
yeah, yeah. My understanding is that he had a whole community around
mhm.
him. Like he had a cult around him, basically. I mean, not like in a creepy way, but like that he had people who were constantly, they like believed in his work and were always asking him questions, and he was, discussing his work with them and so forth.
Yeah, oh yeah. I mean, one of the things that I wish that had survived is that we know that someone asked Spinoza about Shabbatai Tzvi, like what in the hell is happening with Shabbatai Tzvi? So we have the letter that went to him, but we don't have his reply.
Yeah,
So
I mean, what do you think about his knowledge of Kabbalah? Because I mean, he was a Portuguese Jew, right? So he must have, he must have been immersed specifically in a lot of Kabbalah. I would imagine.
well, we know he knows something about it. He's read Herrera, and Herrera is the most philosophically inclined person, sort of assimilating Kabbalah and philosophy, and some of Herrera's ideas definitely end up in the ethics, so that's definitely a point of contact. But he has a low opinion of the Kabbalists. I think um, what does he refer to them as? Like the insane ranting of the Kabbalists, I think is what he
Right.
says at one point in one of his letters. So I think that he knew something about Kabbalah. I don't know that he knew a lot. And also, I don't think he was terribly interested in it. I mean, he's not really hanging out in the Jewish section of town studying Torah. He's 23 when he's excommunicated, which means he would have had some degree of advanced Jewish education, but you're not going to get Kabbalistic education till you're much older, much more advanced than sort of
Right.
basically high school education. So I think he had a smattering knowledge of it, but I don't think that, I think there's a desire for us to see underneath the monism of the ethics a kind of Kabbalistic underwriting, but I don't think that's there. I think that what's there, and you can see this in tracking Spinoza's writings, is that it's really the first time that he subjects the Cartesian philosophy to a geometric arrangement, you can already begin to see him turning up uh, substance, and that even happens in the late Descartes, for that matter. So I think that it's much more the case that if we want to trace his thinking, we should trace it through the later Descartes and actually watch Spinoza's ideas grow as he first puts the Cartesian philosophy, specifically the principles, into the geometric form, and then he has this sort of like holy shit moment, and he's like, yeah, there's just one substance, and that's
Yeah, I
God.
mean, yeah, but I mean that's quite a buggering of of Descartes too. I mean,
Yeah, well, Descartes at the
like
end in the
I like
principles.
his the way he defines substance compared to the way that it was defined, not just by Descartes but also by Aristotle, is it is one of the most misleading rhetorical choices in the history of philosophy, probably.
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
Or and attributes as well. That
right. Well, the attributes are very strange. I mean,
yeah.
but I mean, even at the end, like, we always talk about Descartes being a dualist, but the truth of the matter is that by the time that Descartes writes the principles, he already admits of a third substance. He says there's a divine substance of which the two substances, mind and matter, are simply subsets of. And he says that straight out in the principles, and he doesn't take a lot to go from there to Spinoza, when Spinoza's like, yeah, there's just one substance of which mind and matter are attributes. They're structurally homologous, even though they're put in slightly different forms. But the late Descartes, there's a lot less light, I think, between the late Descartes and Spinoza, in a way
Yeah,
that, again, this is like the more hardcore Deleuzian style Spinozists, um, that makes them angry or something when you say that. But I would just say, like, read the late Descartes and, like,
yeah, yeah. I actually
read
don't know
read how
late
it's
Descartes.
going.
I actually don't know late Descartes very well, or at all. Uh, okay. So let's kind of switch topics, if that's all right with you.
Yeah,
Um, there's really two other topics that I want to discuss a bit, and maybe I'll just mention both of them. So, I mean, one is this very interesting question about how how to conduct philosophy online,
hmm
and I think how to be using YouTube as pedagogy, actually. So like, you know, academia is, I mean, it may be overblown to say academia is collapsing or something like that, but like, um, the, the academic philosophy does not have the relevance that it once had, and I'm aware of.
I don't know that it ever had relevance. I mean, just to, um, yeah, yeah, I just don't know when. I mean, maybe Rawls and stuff, like, because they had, because those guys became sort of part of policy creation,
uh,
but
Well,
um,
yeah, I guess, yeah. I mean, there's continental philosophy, and there's, I think in the analytic philosophy sphere, I think there were plenty of philosophers who ended up contributing to the computer, which
right,
was
sure.
um, has pretty influential. Um, but um, but yeah, like I experience more and more, um, you know, online discourse as a, actually, a really great medium for philosophy. Like I talk to people about the topics that we're talking about um online all day with people, basically. I'm, more and more, I've always kind of been interested in sort of integrating a philosophy practice with my practice as a musician. And those, the music industry is also kind of collapsing. And so, more and more it's like, as, basically an online creator who then goes around and tours, like I am finding it really interesting that I don't have to worry so much about the music industry being over here and having to deal with journalists who, don't want to hear about Deleuze kind of, and then over here there being this other sphere where these academics who also, I think, there's a certain kind of social currency in academia too, where you sort of have to be in it, or like um it's it it restricts itself in certain ways.
Hmm.
And so you've made this decision fairly recently, right? When did you start your channel? Just like less than 2 years ago or something, right?
Yeah, I started in 2020 by total accident. It was never planned to be, sort of let's do this during the pandemic. But yeah, the first videos dropped, I think, the same week that the lockdown started happening here in Michigan. So yeah, frequent, relatively recently, 4 years, which is pretty young for a YouTube channel.
And like you're like so there's the philosophy online thing, and then there's also the relationship to aesthetics, to between philosophy and art and occultism and art, right? And I think that probably part of what people like about your channel is that it looks good too, like like it's well put together, it's kind of it's a performance in a way.
Hmm.
um and um I guess the question could sort of be like, are you excited about the potential of online video and so forth as a medium for pedagogy, as maybe even like a better medium for pedagogy than academia? Or do you see it as, like, I feel like people have views that kind of are all over the place about this, because also it's like the attention economy, casino logic, addiction uh thing, where it's like the internet seems to be kind of destroying civilization in a way also. And so where do you what are your thoughts about this? Are you excited? Are you concerned? Yeah.
I mean, I think excited and concerned are typically this quite similar emotions. Um, I would say that I'm excited about there being as many different kinds of modalities by which intellectual life and spiritual life can flourish. I think human beings, we need those modalities, especially now in sort of the midst of what I sometimes call the famine, the meaning famine. So I'm all about there being lots of modalities by which that can occur, the internet being a modality, YouTube videos being a modality, whatever. There's lots of social media modalities. Um, it's like any other technology. To me, technology is not a question about what's good or bad. It's more a question of what's appropriate and what can it do and what can't it do. And I think that YouTube as a way of providing education is fantastic, but it has real limitations. Uh, one of which is it's a largely one way platform. And so, the way that I try to break that up is by, doing live streams where I can connect to my audience, and I do this every 3 weeks. And so it allows for some two-way bilateral learning but do I think that it'll replace the classroom? I don't think it will. I don't think it should. I don't think the classroom is all that great of a modality either. I think that also can be a very one-way modality. So I don't think it's also that great. I'm not one of these kind of academics who says the classroom is the archetypal modality by which we should be doing learning. That's just laughably wrong. I think the truth of the matter is that human beings are very complicated and there needs to be lots of modalities. And so Esoterica, I can speak for myself. I've shifted those modalities. I do in-person seminars. I do online seminars. I'm starting a class on Agrippa. This Sunday, I'm going to start doing um, sort of what I would call in situ learning. I'm a real believer that it's very important to not just learn ideas, but often learn ideas where they originated, like in the actual geography of their origination. And so there's
Mhm.
a class I want to do where we, for instance, learn Kabbalah, but we learn it in Spain, in Girona. Um, and there's something about there was a moment when I was in Spain once, and I was looking at the very fountain, which is still there, where Moshe de Leon was looking at when he thought about how the spherot worked, or the sort of cascading water falling down these platforms in this fountain. That fountain's still there. And there's something about walking through the streets of these cities, some of which are still there, especially in Spain, and learning Kabbalah in situ, and then coming to the Sefirot and sitting and saying, "All right, we're now in the frame, in the same kind of frame that Moshe de Leon was." So I think that's a modality that I want to also experience, is putting people in the very geography of the origination of ideas, the concreteness of ideas. So I'm excited about all these modalities, but do also think that like TikTok has a place. I think TikTok has a place. I think that short form content has a place in that ecosystem. I don't know that I'm going to be doing that, but I know other people who do that and do that well. So yeah, I'm not a alarmist when it comes to these modalities. I just think that we need to be using those modalities to their strengths and being honest about their weaknesses.
Yeah. Um, yeah,
And
I
also
mean,
being clear that there's no panacea. There's just not going to be any sort of panacea by which we can optimize
yeah,
educational or dialogical encounters. Because
yeah,
to
I
go
mean,
back to
something,
your point about you, so much about dialogy is evental. I have to be at the right place at the right time, having come off the right experience in the right mood, and then like you know, being presents itself to me, to use more Heideggerian language, and that eventality is not something that you can, by definition, you can't predict it, and therefore you can't also curate it. But what I do think you can do is you can have as many different modalities uh, operating as possible, so that it's a numbers game. The more modalities you have operating, the more you have the possibility of an eventual uh, arising, as opposed to if you intellectually ghettoize yourself into one modality, the classroom or YouTube or whatever, you by definition lower that. So you can't predict for any given event, but you can predict for eventality.
yeah, that's yeah, that's an interesting point. I mean, it's like there is something um there is something powerful about, like, it's almost like uh civilization has this little like halo of forms around it that are, like they're like technological possibilities, but they haven't been socially valorized yet. And like um like civilization will need to grow into those areas. And um there's a kind of like fidelity in looking at something and seeing that there could be value in it, and then kind of um yeah, being a part of helping catalyze it in a certain way. I mean, one or I guess being in a place where something unforeseen will emerge. um there's also like a general, like a fantasy of mine is that, like, I would love for society to be, for like just the way that people sort of consume media, to be more and more oriented towards spiritual things and useful pedagogy. Like I think I kind of believe that you know the entertainment industry has always mostly existed kind of for mind control, basically. I mean, not exactly that, like it's definitely a place where people find fulfillment in consuming content, and people find fulfillment in creating content. But like there is this kind of like distractedness, um this way that you can sort of replace living your own life with watching a Netflix show about someone else's life or something like that, and that
It's the
like
Debordian spectacle, right?
yeah,
That
and
that
and
that one lives
I
a simulation through the spectacle.
and I would love as as it becomes more and more um technologically normal and easy to produce rather than consume content through mass media. I would love to kind of see a world that's like sort of like closer to what China's like or something, but with no one being forced to do it. Basically, like where there's a TikTok where people are mostly learning things or uh, you know, working with ascetic practices and that kind of stuff. Uh, and but it's because um it's also beautiful, and that there's this like a big problem with school, I think, is just that like um it's not fine-tuned enough to like kids sort of particular talents and abilities that they might like a kid uh might really love math or whatever it is and just not get a chance to have that awakened because of the sort of like punitive way that it's being presented. um and that you know that would actually be that would have a really powerful political effect long term, where if people are uh, really enjoying pursuing their abilities, and really kind of cultivating compassion for the world and stuff, that um, a lot of the problems in the world that are mostly the result of kind of projection and bad faith would kind of dissolve. And that there's a real, not that those are the only problems in the world by any means, but like that that's a real potential.
Yeah, I think I agree, and I think that what's powerful about YouTube, or yeah, content creation, the way that I do it, is that I don't. It's a numbers game. Most people, I think, are not going to be attuned toward awe or the spiritual most of their lives. Some people are. There's going to be always some people who, every generation produces some subset of people that will become monks or nuns or mystics. Civilization wouldn't function if we all went that direction. But
But don't you think sorry to kind of cut in, but like, don't you think learning how to live your life is spiritual in a way?
sure, absolutely.
Yeah.
And this is the point I was going to make.
Okay.
But everyone will at some point want to go into that road to some degree. There's no person out there, I don't care how scientifically minded or materialist they are, there's a spiritual longing on the part of, I think, everybody, and that longing has different modes of intensity throughout one's life. And I think what's powerful about, and I've heard this from people on the channel, is that most people will experience that and then not have access to resources by which to to actualize that potential, whether this is music or math or whatever. And in my case, it happens to be what I'm an educator about is esoteric spirituality. And so my job, as far as I understand it at some level, is to give people access to those technologies, regardless of what I believe about them, so that when they want them, they can actualize them. Well, and then they can begin the process of that self-education because, as you know, religious education in general in this country is, we basically are functionally illiterate as a society when it comes to religious education. Functionally illiterate. All the more so when it comes to esoteric spirituality. And not only are we functionally illiterate when it comes to religious literacy, esoteric literacy is marred by garbage information and conspiracy theories and racism and you know uh, so much disinformation and bad information about esoteric spirituality. The amount of misinformation I have to deal with on a daily basis is just staggering about what people believe about the occult, for instance, including occultists, which is kind of strange. But so my task is to make that information and those technologies accessible for when people can actuate them. Um, so yeah, that's an opportunity, and I don't take that opportunity or that vocation lightly. But yeah, I do think that um, insofar as we can cultivate awe, I think awe is an incredibly, awe is sort of a sense of the sublime, like even in the Kantian sense of the sublime. I think the more we can cultivate that, the better. And I would say that if we approach, for instance, mathematics is a great example, as a as an opportunity for awe and not as um, an opportunity to learn how to do spreadsheets or something, or just number crunching for the sake of passing standardized testing, then I do think that would have a net positive, and people would come away from mathematics with a much better educational experience. Because I think as a when I got to be in my what 30s, I really retook my ability to understand what math was and really started over. I started teaching myself one math a summer. And yeah, when you approach calculus and differential equations as a road to awe, as questions about infinitude and how we relate to infinitudes, and not in some this is how I feel, man, but like no, they actually got to solve. We got to actually do the derivations. I feel like that's that to me fundamentally shifted how I relate to mathematics. Also, there are
Yeah.
great programs out there. Like one of my favorites is it basically you can learn math from the ground up, but you learn the math that we needed to get to the moon, to like do the slingshot, and like you teach yourself that math. And
Oh,
there's something
cool.
about the like you're like, oh, I now understand all the math
Oh,
that will
that that
get us to the moon. I
that's
think
game
again,
for
that's to
me.
me like you look up at the night sky and you see not just a beautiful orb hung in sublimity, but you also see it as a mathematical relationship. And I think that that's again a road to awe and a road to a more mystical understanding of mathematics, a la someone like Plato or the Pythagoreans for that matter.
Yeah, I know. I love that. I love the word awe. I mean um that brings me to the um yeah, I guess the question of art. I I know we can probably do maybe one last volley. Is that cool for you? We'll
Yeah.
start looking towards closing down. But the the idea of awe is very important to me. And its kind of companion idea, I guess, is something like the sort of objective version of that is glory, right?
Mhm.
God's like God's glory. I was just looking at some writing by John Chrysostom from the Orthodox tradition about he has this idea of kind of encouraging monastics and people having a liturgical experience to compare it to think about it in terms of like how the angels to imagine the angels worshiping God, basically, and that they're sort of seeing God and kind of writhing around, and like he uses all this really lurid poetic language that's very deliberately in there, to awaken a sense of awe
Mhm.
in congregations or in monastics. And one of the first videos of yours that I saw was there was a series of them. I kind of forget which one it was exactly, but I was getting interested in the idea of um, divine glory and there being a kind of face of God. In
Mhm.
Eastern Orthodox, to talk about it in terms of God's energies, right? God's divine energy, where like God is absolutely transcendent, and yet he seems able to appear in the world at certain moments, right? On Mount Tabor, or Moses and the burning bush, and this kind of thing. Um, and uh, yeah, you I learned some things from you about sort of themes in early Jewish mysticism about that, of kind of how what exactly is going on here. Is that a big angel, or or is that where the idea of Jesus comes from? Actually, it's like it's this kind of, it's an angel, but it's a second God, or whatever. And in my music, like pretty much all I care about is like conveying a sense of God's glory, very, very overtly,
Hmm.
and doing it through a kind of extreme transcendental experience, basically. Uh, and so, just I guess the general topic here is, I'd love to hear you say more about the theme of God's glory in relation to Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism, but also how that interfaces with art. Oh, and I want to talk a little bit with you about music, actually. Right.
Hmm.
So I think you said you listen to underground metal. You like it. You also sell metal T-shirts, which is cool.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, so you're sort of into the culture of this kind of sphere, which I was happy to learn. And that I believe you also like Baroque music a lot, and
Hmm.
so, and I'm a big classical music fan as well. So just there's a topic. Any thoughts?
Yeah, a lot there. One, I will say thank you for the music that you make. I will say that I remember reading some of your theoretical writings back in the mid 2000s, and reading the writings and listening to the music and going back and forth and being like, am I hearing what I'm reading? And I was like, yeah, I am hearing it. This is like really, there's this is an impressive feat to have melded some theory and practice together. You don't see that a lot in music. And I just want to express my profound appreciation for how you've pulled that off over several years of producing music in a way that I find yeah, I find that sense of awe and glory really comes through in your music in a way that I really appreciate. And I will say that for bands that I like, it's those moments uh, where they achieve that I'm the most into their music. Where Wolves and Throne, we can get that through sort of a feeling of kind of the glory and awe of nature. Cascadia, Panopticon can get that also to some degree with sort of the Midwest and the winter. Um, so I think that there are moments where they do that, but they do it unintentionally in a way that you've structured your music around that experience in a way that I think is very profound and very powerful, and I'm very thankful for it. So I guess that's the first thing I'll say about it.
Thanks for saying
Um,
that.
yeah. I think also the Baroque, and I'm thinking of Bach most, foremost, right? He wrote church music. So that's kind of his whole jam. It's like the all business. He's in the all business. And I think that the fact that we kind of worship at the feet of Bach is not an accident. I think Sioran, the French pessimist, said that if it weren't for Bach, or rather that Bach is the only evidence that all of creation isn't botched. That if it weren't for Bach, God would be a second-rate entity. That God's the real testament, the fact that God is God is that God made Bach.
I've never quite gotten the take that Bach is like that much head over shoulders, to like Buxtehude or
I
someone
mean,
like that. I mean,
look, I
he's
love
definitely the
Corelli,
best, but
and
like,
I like Corelli, and and Vivaldi, but they don't do it. There's again, it's they're technically, and I melt over a harpsichord as much as the next guy, but there's
Mhm.
not the sublimity I think that comes across in Bach. And thank God
Yeah.
for Mendelssohn for having again, it's leave it to a strange Jewish guy to rescue one of Christianity's greatest composers.
Right.
Barring Mendelssohn, Bach would be still, I think, quite obscure, unfortunately.
Yeah, people forget that he was completely forgotten.
Yeah, he was totally
Yeah.
forgotten. It was Mendelssohn that really brought him roaring back in a way. So I
I
love that Christian Jewish synergy.
never thought about that as a Christian Jewish synergy, but
It's a great moment.
yeah, well, those are some of the best moments, Christian Jewish synergy.
I agree. I
The, the,
agree.
the, the world needs them. Yeah, I think part of it's with Bach, every moment counts. It's
Mhm.
like Scarlatti. Like I probably listen. I mean, Scarlatti moves me more in certain moments, but like just so much of the music is filler, and it's like it's just kind of
Well, so
repeating
much
something
Baroque music is
twice,
chamber music.
whereas with Bach, it's like everything has to happen that happens.
Yeah.
It's like the most filled with consciousness of music that I've heard probably.
Yeah. I also shout out to the one of the organ professors here at the University of Michigan actually re-recorded every single one of Bach's organ pieces on the organs he wrote them for in Germany. And those recordings are now available, which is again, to me, it's all about like geography and place and that kind of the terror of
Oh,
the
he recorded
music.
them in Leipzig.
Oh, in Leipzig, yeah,
Oh, okay. I thought you meant on his
on the
own
actual
organ. Yeah,
organs.
I was over there just last year. I heard someone playing that organ.
Yeah,
Um,
it's really just, it hits different when it's, when you kind of know what's going on. Um, but yeah, again, my love of extreme, of black metal specifically, and my interest in Baroque music, they're tied together. They're talking to each other in a way that I think, in a way I think it's true for a lot of black metal musicians. I've talked to some of the guys in Krallis and other guys, and they're like, yeah, we're basically writing Baroque music.
yeah,
Now, and of a certain kind of strange form, but it is a kind of Baroque music, and so it's unsurprising that I've, you know,
you're really kind of constructing things a lot more than you are in most kinds of rock music. Like in most rock music, it's you're not really thinking about it as a linear flow that has a crescendo. I would also say that a lot of, and thanks for what you said about my music, but like that it's not so different from a lot of black metal in in the sense of seeking to cultivate glory. I think that I uh and because again of the relationship to occultism, where
Mhm.
like maybe I guess the version of glory that I like is a little happier or something, I guess, or like whatever it is, but plenty of black metal musicians are esotericists, maybe to a
Sure.
scary degree, and yeah, what uh, and then there's of course the connection of between Aleister Crowley and metal and rock music,
Right.
um, but
Yeah,
I
I think
guess
that
you,
this question of the glory is actually an interesting one, because there are two kinds of glory, right? There's, and this is true of Christianity, it's true of Islam, it's definitely true of Judaism, is that you have the kind of Deus absconditus, the what we call in Hebrew the kavod nistar, the hidden glory, and that, there are mystics of that hidden glory.
mm,
Um, Trying to think of a really great, um, yeah, Heidevich is, I think, a great mystic of that kind of hidden glory, the divine darkness, in a way that Mechtilde Magdeburg is all about the divine light, the divine flowing light of the Godhead. And I think that there are two kind of logically connected glories. There's that revealed glory, the theophanic glory, and there's also that God is a God who hides in shadows and smoke and fire, the God of Mount Sinai, in the Arafel, which is a great term in Hebrew, the deep darkness. And I think that black metal conjures both of those kinds of sublimity, that you get this sort of dark, brooding, um, frightful aloneness, the flight of the alone to the alone. And I think you have that in some of the more sinister kinds of black metal, which are very important. But I think that what's often like lacking, and what you do quite well, you're really the exemplar of doing it, is this other kind of theophonic, regal. I think one of the titles of your
yeah.
first song, one of the songs on one of your records is Fanfare. It's this, this very theophonic, like something is showing up, a king or a royal being. And I think that those are logically connected, and I don't think they're ever detachable, actually. I think that it's a question of emphasis, not an ontological question, and that you'll have mystics in the tradition. Again, I think of mostly the Latin West, because that's what I'm most familiar with. But even among the Beguines, you'll have some Beguines for whom the Deus absconditus, that I think Heidevik says that she wants to go to hell because in hell she'll be trapped away from God and will crave God all the more because she can never have God. And it's the craving of the divine in the darkest regions of hell that she wants. So she's like, I don't even want to go to heaven.
Right.
You know, this extreme, you know, that's like black metal if there ever was black metal, craving for hell so that
Yeah.
she can experience ultimate desire. It's a very like Clive Barker kind of BDSM spirituality. And then that's to be contrasted with Mechthild, who is caught up, enraptured in the flowing light of the Godhead, the Trinitarian flowing light. And those couldn't be more different in influence or more different in emphasis, but they're united in their theology. And I think that's logically, there's a profound logic in that. And I've always found, this is why I love mysticism, is that I found the great genius of mysticism is is an acceptance of that polarity, and then to muck about with that polarity, inverting it, reversing it, flipping it, in a sort of a spiritual inducing vertigo. And that's certainly what you get in Angelo Foligno, or I'm sitting at Meister Eckhart or whatever. I prefer the women mystics often, because I think that they're a bit more unbridled and actually a bit more honest in a way that Thaler or Suso or Eckhart are a bit more guarded, although being guarded didn't save Eckhart. But yeah, I think that
Yeah.
polarity of the Deus absconditus, so the Kavod star, and then the Kavod revealed, the theophonic. Um, I think those are uh,
I think
powerful.
what you just said was very beautiful, very profound, and maybe that's a great place to stop.
All right,
I
sounds good.
couldn't agree more with that point. So,
Yeah.
um, uh, yeah, let's any closing thoughts you have?
No, I wish you the best with the podcast. Podcast can be, as a content creator. I want to say, I want to issue my condolences and wish you the very best. Because it's just, you know, not that you don't know what it's like to have a target on your back. You've experienced that to a significant degree, I know. But yeah, there's a weird anti-intellectualism that exists in some of these spaces where really smart people, really hated other people, are trying to fill their time with intellectual and spiritual development, and it irks them. And so I don't know. I hope you irk a lot of people, and I hope the podcast is very successful in irking that kind of morbid anti-intellectualism.
Yeah, no, I'm I have enough of an online presence, with like YouTube videos here and there and stuff that like I'm well aware.
Yep. Yeah. Like I said,
But
you
yeah,
know
but
better
I'm,
than
I'm I'm
most.
I'm sure the more you lean into it, the more it leans into you, at the same time. But it's like you also just never know, um, how powerful of an effect you are having on someone who you never even get to talk to.
Mhm.
uh, you know and
Yeah,
that that
it's
that, that
the asymmetry of these relationships and the parasocial stuff can be, it's a real thing. And
but I mean a positive one too,
yeah,
that like
absolutely.
you can
Absolutely.
really just wake someone up, or like set them on a course of intellectual pursuit or spiritual pursuit, or
No, I get
whatever
emails
that
all
they
the
wouldn't
time
have.
from people who, who really, they had, they really needed something. They found a video and it gave them access to what they needed, and they're off to the races. And, as an educator, that's the best feeling in the world, to know that you've empowered someone to become the best teacher they'll ever have, and the best teacher you will ever have is you. And
Yeah,
I find that when you can, as me as an educator, when I can empower someone to do that, it's just the absolute best. It's a win.
yeah, no, I think you're doing